The wind tasted like dust and endings. It whipped across the yard as Gentry Lark stood barefoot in the dirt, her whole life stuffed into a single carpet bag at her feet. Her dignity was hanging on by a thread so thin it was about to snap. "You don't belong here anymore," Everett said. He didn't even bother to step off the porch. His voice was flat, hard, like a stone skipping across a frozen pond. "Go back east. You're not my problem." Gentry didn't cry. She wouldn't give him that. Not after everything. She kept her voice as steady as she could. "She was my sister. She was my wife," Everett snapped back, his words like a whip crack. "And she's gone. I have 2 mouths to feed and a ranch to run. I don't have room for dead weight." Then, the door behind him creaked open. 2 small faces peeked out. Kellen and Katie, her niece and nephew. The sight of them made her chest ache, a deep, hollow pain. Everett saw her looking. He stepped in front of the doorway, blocking them from her sight, and shut the door with a final heavy thud. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. "I helped raise them," she whispered, the words lost in the wind. "You were charity," he sneered. "I didn't marry your sister just to take in her spinster sibling." His eyes narrowed into slits. "If you're not gone by dark, I'll have one of the hands drag you to town myself." Gentry turned without another word. There was nothing left to say. The carpetbag felt heavier than it ever had before. It held little more than a few threadbare dresses, her mother's Bible, and the worn silver locket that held a lock of her sister's hair, a memory she could hold in her palm. She just walked. The road was dry and long. The sun was already starting its slow, lazy descent behind the hills. Her boots had been left behind in her hurry to leave, and the sharp gravel of the road bit into the soles of her feet with every step. She didn't look back. She couldn't. An hour later, maybe more, she passed a fence line. One of the posts was leaning hard to the right, like it had just given up. She paused, needing to rest. The sun was low now, casting everything in that strange golden light that could make even the deepest grief look soft around the edges. She sank to her knees beside that broken fence, the dust puffing up around her, and finally pressed her hands to her face. The tears she'd held back finally came, silent and hot. "Reckon that's not the usual way folks come down this road?" The voice was low, warm. It startled her so bad she nearly jumped out of her skin. She looked up fast. A man sat on his horse just a few yards away, the reins held loose in one hand, his hat slanted low against the setting sun. His voice matched the quiet slope of his shoulders and the kind, steady look in his eyes. He was young, maybe early 30s, with skin tanned by the sun and a short beard that shaded his jaw. He dismounted slowly, careful, like he was approaching a spooked deer. "Name's Boone Prescott. My land's that way." He motioned with his head back behind him. "You look like you could use some water. Maybe a place to sit that isn't the dirt." Gentry swallowed past the thick knot in her throat and managed a small, shaky nod. Boone led his horse over. He took the heavy carpetbag from her hand like it weighed nothing at all and slung it over his shoulder. "You've walked a fair bit," he said, his voice still quiet. "My sister's husband." "He doesn't want me anymore," she said, the words tasting like ash. He didn't ask for more than that. He just looked at her, his gaze taking in her bare feet, her tear-streaked face. He just said, "Well, I don't much like the sound of that." And then he helped her up onto his horse like it was the most natural thing in the world. His homestead was just over the next ridge, a small place tucked into a sunlit hollow. There was a barn, a neat little house, and a few chickens scratching near the porch. It was quiet, peaceful. The inside of his house smelled like coffee and wood smoke. It was a clean smell, a safe smell. He handed her a tin cup of cool water and pointed to a simple wooden chair by the stove. "Sit. I'll boil something for supper." She just stared at him as he moved around the small room, lighting a fire in the stove, setting a pot onto heat. He moved with a purpose, a quiet competence. "You're not going to ask what happened," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He glanced at her over his shoulder. "No," he said simply. "You look like you've already lived through it. No need to say it out loud unless you want to." He gave her a bowl of thick stew and a chunk of fresh bread. She ate slowly, her hands trembling. The fire from the stove warmed the soles of her feet, chasing away a chill that felt like it had settled deep in her bones. She hadn't been this warm in weeks. When the sky turned a deep bruised pink outside the window, Boone stood by the door, his arms folded across his chest. "You can stay here tonight. Next few nights, if you need." He paused, then added, "I've got a spare room. No one's used it since my brother passed." Gentry looked up at him, her heart giving a painful lurch. "I can work. I know how to sew, bake, mend fences. I can care for children." Boone held up one hand, stopping her. "You don't owe me anything." She blinked hard against a fresh wave of tears. "Thank you." He just gave her a single quiet nod. That night, she lay on the narrow bed in the spare room. It was small, but clean. Her bag was on the floor beside her, the locket still warm in her palm. The house was silent, but it didn't feel empty. She could hear Boone's steady footsteps as he moved around outside her door, a calm, reassuring presence. And that's when she cried again. Silent tears pressed into the rough pillowcase. Not because she missed Everett, not even because she had nowhere else to go, but because after so much cruelty, someone had finally been kind. As she drifted off to sleep, her eyes fell on something in the corner of the room. A large, sturdy-looking trunk made of dark wood bound with iron straps. A heavy padlock secured it shut. It seemed out of place in the simple room. She wondered what a man like Boone would need to keep under lock and key. The next few days fell into a quiet rhythm. Gentry found her purpose again in the simple act of doing. Boone had enough chores for 10 men, and though he never once asked for her help, she gave it freely. She swept the porch until it was clean, gathered the warm eggs from the henhouse each morning, and patched the tear in his only good Sunday shirt with neat, tiny stitches. He never hovered. He never watched her work, but he noticed. On the third day, he came in from the barn, his hands covered in grease from fixing a wagon wheel. He found her at the table, her hands dusted with flour, kneading a batch of bread dough. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice low. "I want to," she replied, not looking up from her work. His eyes held hers for just a moment longer than they had before. "All right." That afternoon, he took her out to the pasture. One of his cows had given birth too early, and the calf was weak, struggling for breath. She knelt beside him in the straw, pressing a clean cloth to its tiny, shivering ribs, while Boone cupped its small head in his large, gentle hands. "Will it live?" she asked, her own breath tight in her chest. "Maybe," he said, his focus entirely on the fragile creature. "Sometimes they surprise you." The calf did live. Gentry stayed up most of the night with it, checking on it every hour, whispering soft words of encouragement. Boone found her at dawn, fast asleep in a pile of hay, curled up near the pen. He didn't wake her. He just took off his heavy coat and laid it over her like a blanket. A week passed, then another. The arrangement was unspoken. He never asked her to leave. She never brought it up. One evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. The sky was wide and gold and empty. Boone leaned back in his rocking chair, sipping coffee. Gentry sat on the top step, her hands folded in her lap. "You could stay," he said suddenly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. She turned to look at him, her heart skipping a beat. "Here," he clarified, giving a slow nod. "I don't have much, but the place is quiet. The work is honest. And I like having you here." Her heart started beating faster, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. You don't even know me. I know when someone is kind, he said, his gaze direct and steady. I know when someone cares enough to stay up all night with a sick calf. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she felt it down to her soul. And I know I haven't looked forward to coming in from the fields in a long, long time. Until now. Gentry's throat was dry. She reached out, uncertain, and laid her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. He immediately turned his palm up and laced his fingers through hers, a perfect fit. They sat like that in the falling light, the quiet between them soft and sure. She looked out at the darkening hills, then back at him. I think I could stay. Boone smiled. It wasn't a wide, flashy smile. It was small and slow, but it sent a wave of warmth through her entire chest. Then that settled. He lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. There was nothing rushed or uncertain about it. It felt like something solid, something just beginning. But as she sat there, his hand holding hers, her gaze drifted back to the window of her room. The spare room. The room where his brother had passed. And in the gathering dark, she could just make out the shape of that locked trunk in the corner. A silent, iron-bound question that still had no answer. The first frost arrived before the trees had a chance to shed all their gold. Gentry woke early, pulled from sleep by the deep stillness of the house, that profound hush that falls over the land when the cold truly settles in. Boone was already outside. She could see his dark shape moving slowly across the yard through the window, a lantern swinging in his hand as he checked on the animals. She dressed in silence, the floorboards cold beneath her bare feet, and pulled on the thick wool shawl he'd left folded at the foot of her bed. It smelled faintly of cedar and wood ash, a smell she was starting to associate with safety. When she stepped onto the porch, the frosted grass crunched under her soles. Boone was just coming back from the barn, the lantern light dancing on the ground. "You're up early," he said, his voice a little rough in the morning chill. "Couldn't sleep," she answered, watching her own breath linger in the air like a ghost. He gave a small nod and set the lantern on the porch rail. "We'll need to start cutting firewood after breakfast. The stove won't keep enough heat once the north wind turns." "I can help," she said immediately. He looked at her then, the half-light of dawn catching in his eyes. A flicker of something she couldn't quite read. "I know." They worked side by side that morning, the sharp, rhythmic crack of the axe splitting the crisp air. Boone hauled the heavy logs, and Gentry stacked them neatly under the lean-to. By midday, her hands were red and raw, but she didn't complain. He didn't ask her to stop either. They just worked, a silent team. Later, as the sun sat high and weak in a pale sky, they rested on the back steps, sharing a chipped tin mug of sweetened coffee. Boone stretched his long legs out in the dirt, his forearms dusted with wood shavings. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked, his eyes fixed on the far ridge. "I used to," she admitted. "When I was younger, I thought maybe I'd see a big city, a place with gas lamps and towering buildings and bookshops on every corner." What changed? She thought for a moment, the steam from the mug warming her face. "I stopped having reasons to dream about things I couldn't reach." Boone didn't speak for a long while. A single crow cut across the sky, its wings a slash of black against the thin clouds. "You could still go," he said finally, his voice quiet. She turned her head to look at him. "Do you want me to?" "No," he said, without a shred of hesitation. "But I'd understand it if you did." She watched him trace a line in the dirt with the heel of his boot, a slow, absent motion. "I've never known someone to say something like that and mean it." "I don't say things I don't mean." Time passed. The wind picked up, carrying the brittle scent of dried pine. Gentry pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. An idea sparked in her mind, a way to contribute something more than just labor. I used to sew for the church ladies back when I lived in Red Lodge, she said quietly. Alterations mostly. Sometimes they'd let me keep the scraps. I made quilts out of them. He glanced at her. You still do? I could, she said, if there was a use for it. Boone stood up and stretched, the muscles in his back pulling tight. Then he held out a hand to her. Come with me. She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. He led her into the house, through the main room, and to a door she'd never seen him open. The cellar door. He lit another lantern and led her down the narrow wooden steps. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and stored apples. In the back corner, tucked beneath an old, dusty oilcloth, sat a treadle sewing machine. It was my mother's, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. I haven't touched it in years. Gentry stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat. She brushed a thick layer of dust off the smooth, dark wood. Her fingers found the iron wheel, stiff and cold from disuse. She made all our clothes on this, Boone went on, his eyes distant, lost in a memory. Even our Sunday best. I kept it because, well, I guess because letting it go felt like forgetting her. While he was speaking, Gentry's fingers traced the intricate carvings on the side of the machine. Her nail caught on something, a tiny, almost invisible maker's mark near the base. It wasn't from a big company she recognized. It was a single stylized letter, a C. Her own sister's name was Clara, and Clara had loved to carve, a skill their father had taught her. She used to mark her little carvings with that exact same C. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, washed over Gentry. It was impossible, a coincidence. It had to be. Boone didn't seem to notice her sudden stillness. He was still lost in his memories. She was the kind of woman who baked for neighbors, who made bandages when someone got kicked by a horse. I think she would have liked you. Gentry forced herself to look away from the carving. She reached for the lamp he was holding and turned the flame up a little higher, needing more light. The machine's shadow stretched across the stone wall behind it, long and distorted, like a memory with a secret. I think I would have liked her too, Gentry managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Boone set his hand gently on her back, just between her shoulder blades. He didn't move it, didn't press. He just left it there, a warm, steady weight. They stood together in the flickering lamplight, neither of them speaking. But for Gentry, the silence was no longer comfortable. It was filled with the hum of 1,000 unspoken questions, all of them circling that impossible carved letter C. That night, Gentry couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, the only sounds the crackle of the dying fire in the stove and the steady breathing of Boone sleeping in the other room. But her mind was racing, turning that little carved C over and over again. It was a wild, foolish thought. Her sister Clara had lived her whole life near Red Lodge, miles and miles from here. She'd never even met Boone Prescott. Had she? After hours of staring at the ceiling, she slipped out of bed. The floorboards were cold under her feet. She crept through the dark house, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she was looking for. A sign. An answer. Anything. She found herself standing in front of the locked trunk in her room. It was madness. She was a guest in this house. This man had shown her nothing but kindness, and here she was, about to violate his trust, to pry into his secrets. But the need to know was a physical ache, a gnawing hunger that drowned out her guilt. She remembered seeing a small, rusted key hanging on a nail inside the pantry, almost hidden behind a sack of beans. She'd assumed it was for the smokehouse. Now she wasn't so sure. Moving like a thief, she retrieved the key. Her hand was trembling so badly she could barely fit it into the keyhole of the heavy padlock. It resisted at first, then with a groan of protesting metal, the lock clicked open. She lifted the heavy lid of the trunk. The air that rose up smelled of dried lavender and old paper. The first thing she saw was a neatly folded quilt, stitched in a pattern she recognized instantly. A wandering foot pattern, Clara's favorite. Gentry had helped her finish one just like it years ago. With shaking hands, she lifted the quilt. Beneath it wasn't men's clothing or tools belonging to a long-lost brother. It was filled with letters, dozens of them, tied in bundles with faded blue ribbon. And the handwriting on the top envelope made her gasp. It was her sister's. She sank to the floor, the key falling from her numb fingers. She pulled the ribbon from the first bundle and unfolded a letter. "My dearest B," it began. "Everett was in a foul mood again today. He said the drought is making the cattle mean, but I think it's him that's mean. I watched you from the ridge today while you were mending your fence. You didn't see me. Sometimes I think if I can just see you, even from a distance, I can make it through another day in this house. Kellen asked about you. He calls you the quiet man on the black horse. He's a smart boy. He knows kindness when he sees it. Yours always, C." Gentry's hands shook so violently she could barely read the words. She tore through the letters, her breath coming in ragged sobs. They were love letters. Passionate, desperate love letters between her sister, Clara, and Boone. They had been meeting in secret for over a year. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He was the man her sister had loved, the man she was planning to run away with. The last letter was at the very bottom of the trunk. It was dated just one day before her sister's death. "Boone, my love, it's all arranged. I've sold the last of Mother's jewelry and have the money for the tickets. Everett is riding to Billings for the cattle auction. He'll be gone for 3 days. It's our chance. Meet me at the leaning fence post on the old road at sundown tomorrow. I'll have the children with me. We'll be a family, finally. Don't be late, my love. My whole life is waiting for you. Forever yours, Clara." The leaning fence post. The very spot where he had found her. It hadn't been an accident. He hadn't just stumbled upon a woman in distress. He had been waiting for her sister, and she never came. Everett had told everyone Clara had fallen from the hayloft. A terrible accident. He'd found her at the bottom of the ladder, her neck broken. Gentry had never fully believed it. Clara was as sure-footed as a mountain goat, but she'd had no proof, just a cold, ugly feeling in her gut. Now she knew. Everett must have come home early. He must have found the letter. A floorboard creaked in the hall. Gentry looked up, her eyes wide with terror. Boone was standing in the doorway. He wasn't holding a lamp. The moonlight from the window cast his face in shadow, but she could see the look in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a deep, soul-crushing sadness. He had heard her. He knew what she'd found. The silence in the room was absolute. He didn't move. She didn't breathe. "You should have asked," he finally said, his voice raw with a grief so profound it seemed to suck all the air from the room. "I didn't know what to ask," she whispered, the letters trembling in her hand. He took a slow step into the room, then another, until he was kneeling on the floor in front of her. He gently took the letters from her grasp and placed them back in the trunk, his movements careful, reverent. "I met her at the market in Red Lodge," he began, his voice barely audible. "She was buying ribbon for Katie's hair. We just started talking. It was easy, the easiest thing I'd ever done." He stared into the open trunk, at the story of a life that had been stolen from him. "She told me about Everett, about how he was, cold, cruel. She was trapped. We knew it was wrong, meeting in secret, but it was the only thing that felt right." His voice broke. "That day, I waited at that fence post until the moon was high in the sky. I knew something was wrong. I rode to the edge of their property, hid in the trees. I saw the doctor's wagon leaving. That's how I found out." He looked up at Gentry, and in the faint light she could see tears tracking paths through the dust on his cheeks. "I believe he killed her, Gentry. I believe he found out she was leaving him and he pushed her." The words hung in the air, confirming the terrible suspicion that had haunted Gentry for months. Ever since that day, Boone continued, his voice hardening, I've been watching that ranch, waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for exactly. Justice, a chance, something. When I saw Everett throw you out, leaving you with nothing, I knew that was my chance. It wasn't an accident I found you. I was watching. I followed you. Gentry felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This kind, gentle man was also a man consumed by a singular purpose, a man capable of a patience that was terrifying in its intensity. They were no longer a stranger and a grateful refugee. They were something else entirely. They were allies, bound together by Clara's memory and a terrible, unspoken secret. He has my sister's children, Gentry said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. He has her children in that house. Boone's eyes met hers, and the sadness in them was now replaced by a cold, hard fire. A dangerous fire. I know, he said, and we're going to get them back. The revelation changed everything. The air in the small house grew thick with unspoken plans and shared grief. They were no longer just two lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. They were conspirators. Every shared meal, every quiet evening on the porch was now underlined with a tense, waiting energy. Boone started teaching Gentry how to shoot. He had a small rifle he used for hunting, and he'd take her out to the far pasture in the afternoons. You need to know how, he said, his voice flat and serious as he showed her how to load the cartridge. I'm not planning on trouble, but out here trouble doesn't always ask for an invitation. Her hands shook the first time she held the heavy weapon, but she learned quickly. The sharp crack of the rifle shot echoing off the hills felt like a declaration of war. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a lone figure heading straight for their homestead. Get inside, Boone said instantly, his hand going to the pistol tucked into his belt, a weapon she'd never seen him carry before. Go to the cellar. Don't come out until I tell you. Gentry's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did as she was told, her mind racing. Who could it be? She hurried down the narrow cellar steps, leaving the door open just a crack so she could hear. The air was cool and smelled of earth. She crouched in the darkness, listening. She heard the crunch of boots on the gravel outside, then a man's voice, rough and unfriendly. Prescott, heard you had some company. News travels fast, Boone replied, his own voice deceptively calm. It does when folks see you buying dresses and hair ribbons in town, the man said with a dry chuckle. Sheriff Bullock, by the way, just making the rounds, checking on folks. Gentry pressed her ear closer to the crack in the door. The sheriff. Everything's fine here, Sheriff, Boone said. Is it? Sheriff Bullock's voice was laced with suspicion. Because I had a visit from Everett Shaw yesterday. Said his thieving sister-in-law ran off. He's worried she might be bothering his neighbors. You haven't seen a woman on her own, have you? Dark hair. Looks half-starved. A cold sweat broke out on Gentry's skin. Thieving? Everett was poisoning the well, turning her into a criminal. There was a long pause. Gentry held her breath. Can't say that I have, Boone said smoothly. It's just been me out here, same as always. That's so? The sheriff said. Funny. I could have sworn I saw 2 sets of tracks leading up to this place. I've been breaking in a new mare. She's skittish. Paces a lot, Boone lied, his voice as even as a calm lake. Gentry could hear the sheriff walking around the porch, his boots heavy on the wood. He was looking for proof, a sign of her presence. She prayed she hadn't left anything outside. Well, the sheriff said finally, his voice moving away as he presumably walked back to his horse. You keep an eye out. Everett Shaw is an important man in this county. He's got friends. It pays to stay on his good side. The threat was unmistakable. I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff, Boone said. Gentry stayed hidden in the cellar until she heard the sound of the sheriff's horse fading into the distance. Only then did Boone come and open the door. His face was pale, his jaw set in a hard line. "He knows," Gentry whispered, her voice trembling. "Or he suspects." "He's on Everett's payroll like half the county," Boone said, his voice grim. "We don't have much time. Everett is trying to paint you as a fugitive. If Bullock finds you here, he'll drag you back to Everett, and no one will ever hear from you again." The fear was so intense it was dizzying. They were trapped. They couldn't stay here, but they couldn't leave without the children. Their quiet homestead no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a cage, with the walls slowly closing in. That night, Boone didn't sleep. Gentry could hear him pacing in the main room, back and forth, like a caged animal. The weight of their situation was crushing them. They needed a plan. They needed a miracle. The next morning, Boone decided to ride into Red Lodge. "It's a risk, with the sheriff sniffing around," he said, pulling on his coat. "But I have to check the post office. It's the one thing Clara and I set up that Everett wouldn't know about. A private box, just in case." "In case of what?" Gentry asked. "In case one of us needed to send a message the other could get without anyone knowing." His eyes were dark with a pain that seemed endless. "I've been checking it every month since she died, hoping for, I don't know what, a letter from a lawyer, a notice, something that proves she wasn't just gone." He rode out at dawn, leaving Gentry alone with her thoughts and the loaded rifle propped against the wall. The house felt huge and empty without him. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching horse. Every shadow seemed to hold the shape of Sheriff Bullock. Hours crawled by. The sun reached its peak and began its slow slide toward the western hills. Gentry tried to keep busy, mending a tear in one of Boone's shirts, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Just as the sun was touching the horizon, casting long, menacing shadows across the yard, she saw him. A single rider, coming fast. It was Boone. He didn't slow as he reached the house, swinging down from the saddle before his horse had even come to a full stop. He burst through the door, his face flushed with a wild, desperate excitement she had never seen before. In his hand he was clutching a single sealed envelope. "There was a letter," he said, his voice breathless. "It was addressed to her, to Clara." He handed it to Gentry. It was from a law firm in Billings. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal and unfolded the heavy paper inside. The letter was dated months ago. It informed Clara that a distant great-aunt had passed away, leaving her a small inheritance. It wasn't a fortune, but it was something. A few $100s, and more importantly, the deed to a small forgotten plot of land. 40 acres, bordering the creek at the southern edge of Everett's property. This was it. This was their escape plan. The money and the land were how Clara was going to start her new life with Boone and the children. But that wasn't the part that made Gentry's blood run cold. She scanned the legal description of the land on the deed. It included specific landmarks, an old oak tree, a series of rock formations, and, most importantly, full access rights to the waters of Willow Creek. The same creek Everett was currently in a violent dispute over with his neighbor. The same dispute that Sheriff Bullock had come to warn Boone about. Everett wasn't just trying to steal water from his neighbor. He was trying to steal land that had belonged to his dead wife, land that now, by law, belonged to his orphaned children, Kellen and Katie. They didn't just have a secret anymore. They had a weapon. The deed felt heavy in Gentry's hand, heavier than paper had any right to be. It was proof. It was leverage. It was a stick of dynamite waiting for a match. "He doesn't know," Boone said, pacing the small room like a wolf. "He thinks that land is his. He's been trying to fence it off for months. That's why he's fighting with his neighbor, Elias Tompkins. Everett is trying to steal his own children's inheritance." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it left Gentry speechless. Everett's cruelty wasn't just emotional. It was a deep, calculated greed. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The rifle leaning against the wall suddenly seemed inadequate. This was a fight that couldn't be won with a single bullet. Boone stopped his pacing and looked at her, his eyes blazing with a newfound resolve. We don't hide anymore. We don't wait for him to make the next move. We ride there. Tomorrow. To Everett's ranch? The thought sent a jolt of pure fear through her. Yes, he said, his voice hard as iron. We don't go in shooting. We go in with the law in our hands. We show him this deed. We tell him we know what he's been doing. He took a deep breath, his plan forming as he spoke. We offer him a choice. He signs over legal guardianship of Kellen and Katie to you, their only living blood relative. In exchange, you sign this deed over to him. He gets the land he wants so badly, and we get the children. He'll take the deal. Greed is the only language he understands. It was a brilliant, terrifying plan. It used Everett's own monstrous greed against him. And if he doesn't take the deal? Gentry asked, the question hanging in the air. Boone's face darkened. If he doesn't take the deal, we ride straight to Elias Tompkins. We show him the deed. We show him that Everett has no legal claim to that creek. And then we ride to the judge in the next county, not Bullock, and we tell him everything. We expose him for the thief and the fraud that he is. It was a gamble, a huge one. They would be walking straight into the lion's den. But for the first time since she'd been cast out onto that dusty road, Gentry felt a flicker of hope. They weren't just running anymore. They were fighting back. They left at first light. The air was cold and sharp, and the sky was a pale, washed-out gray. Boone rode his steady black mare, and he'd borrowed a gentle old gelding from a neighbor for Gentry. He didn't say how he'd explained needing the horse. Some things were better left unsaid. The deed was wrapped in oilcloth and tucked safely in Gentry's satchel. Boone had his rifle in its scabbard, and the pistol was once again tucked into his belt. The silence on the ride was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts, playing out every possible scenario in their minds. As they crested the final ridge overlooking Everett's ranch, they saw it immediately: chaos. There were 3 horses tied to the rail in front of the house. One belonged to Sheriff Bullock. Another, a rugged-looking Mustang, must belong to the neighbor, Elias Tompkins. And a third belonged to a circuit judge Gentry recognized from town. It seemed their private war was about to become a public spectacle. "Something's wrong," Boone said, pulling his horse to a stop. "The judge being here, Everett must have pushed things too far." They urged their horses forward, down into the valley. As they got closer, they could hear shouting, angry voices, overlapping and indistinguishable. They dismounted and walked toward the porch. The front door was wide open. Inside, Everett stood with his back to them, his face red with fury. Across from him stood an older, weathered-looking man with a shotgun held loosely in his hands, Elias Tompkins. Sheriff Bullock was standing between them, trying and failing to keep the peace. The circuit judge sat at the dining table, a stack of papers in front of him, looking thoroughly unimpressed. "I'm telling you, Tompkins, that creek is on my property line," Everett roared. "And I'll see you in hell before I let your scrawny cattle drink from it." "That water belongs to everyone, Shaw, and you know it," Tompkins shot back. "You've been moving your fence posts in the dead of night for a month." "That's enough, both of you," the judge said, his voice cutting through the noise like a razor. "Mr. Shaw, you have provided no proof of your claim. Mr. Tompkins, put that firearm down before the sheriff decides to arrest you." It was the perfect moment. Gentry took a deep breath, clutched her satchel, and stepped through the doorway. Every head in the room snapped toward her. Everett's face went from red to a sickly mottled white. "You!" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I have something the judge needs to see," Gentry said, her voice surprisingly steady. She ignored Everett and walked straight to the table, pulling the oilcloth-wrapped deed from her bag. She handed it to the judge. "This is the deed to the 40 acres bordering Willow Creek," she said clearly. It was inherited by my sister, Clara Shaw. Upon her death, it passed to her children, Kellen and Katie Shaw. Everett has no legal claim to it whatsoever." The judge unrolled the document. His eyes scanned the legal description, his eyebrows climbing higher and higher on his forehead. Sheriff Bullock looked like he'd just swallowed a hornet. Elias Tompkins stared, his mouth hanging open. Everett just stood there, his chest heaving, a strange guttural noise building in his throat. The carefully constructed world he had built on lies and bullying was crumbling around him, right here, in front of his enemies. The judge looked up from the deed, his eyes cold and hard as steel. He looked at Everett. "Mr. Shaw, it appears you have some explaining to do." But Everett wasn't looking at the judge. He was looking at Gentry. And the look in his eyes was not just anger. It was the pure, unhinged rage of a cornered animal. "You!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You and her, always plotting, always whispering behind my back." He lunged. But he didn't lunge for the judge, or for Tompkins. He lunged for Gentry. His hands were outstretched like claws, his face a mask of fury. Boone, who had been standing silently by the door, moved like lightning. He stepped between them, pushing Gentry back, his hand reaching for the pistol at his belt. It was all a blur of motion and shouting. Sheriff Bullock yelled, "Shaw, no!" Elias Tompkins raised his shotgun. A shot exploded in the confined space of the room. The sound was deafening. Gentry screamed. Everett stopped dead in his tracks. A look of stunned surprise crossed his face. A small, dark red circle appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his eyes wide, and then he collapsed to the floor like a sack of grain, his head hitting the wooden planks with a sickening thud. The silence that followed was even louder than the gunshot. Smoke curled from the barrel of Elias Tompkins's shotgun. The old man looked down at the weapon in his hands as if he'd never seen it before. Then he looked at Gentry, his eyes filled with a kind of weary relief. "He was gonna kill you," the old rancher said, his voice raspy. "I saw it in his eyes. He wasn't gonna stop." The aftermath was a slow, surreal haze. The circuit judge, a man clearly accustomed to chaos, took control immediately. He questioned everyone, his voice calm and methodical. Sheriff Bullock, now faced with 4 witnesses, including a judge, and a deed that proved Everett was a fraud, had no choice but to follow the letter of the law. His loyalty to his wealthy patron had vanished the moment Everett hit the floor. Elias Tompkins told his story, his voice shaking but firm. He said Everett had threatened him, that he'd seen the madness in the man's eyes when Gentry revealed the deed. He said he fired to protect an innocent woman from a violent attack. Boone corroborated the story. The judge, who had seen the lunge with his own eyes, nodded his agreement. Gentry, still in shock, simply told the truth. She explained how Everett had thrown her out, how she'd found the deed, how she'd only come to secure the safety of her niece and nephew. By the time the sun set, it was all over. The judge ruled the shooting a clear case of self-defense. Everett Shaw, a man who had ruled his small corner of the world through fear and intimidation, was dead. And Gentry Lark was named the temporary legal guardian of Kellen and Katie Shaw, pending a formal hearing. She was their only kin. There was no one else. They didn't go back to Boone's homestead that night. The judge insisted they ride into Red Lodge. The children had to be officially released into her care from the boarding house where they'd been placed. The boarding house smelled of boiled cabbage and disinfectant. It was a grim, colorless place. The matron, a stern-faced woman named Miss Whitcomb, greeted them with suspicion in her eyes. "I've heard rumors," she said, her lips pursed into a thin line, "about what happened at the Shaw Ranch." "What happened was justice," the judge said, his voice leaving no room for argument. Miss Whitcomb led them into a small, bleak parlor, and there, sitting at a low table, were Kellen and Katie. They were drawing on scraps of paper with worn-down pencil stubs. They looked smaller than Gentry remembered, pale and lost. Kellen looked up first, his eyes so like his mother's widened. Then Katie saw her, a single heartbeat of silence. Then both children rose from their chairs and ran to her. They didn't make a sound. They just crashed into her, their small arms wrapping around her waist, their faces buried in her dress. Gentry dropped to her knees and wrapped them in her arms, a great shuddering sob breaking from her chest. She held them tight, rocking back and forth, tears streaming down her face. All the fear, all the grief, all the uncertainty of the past weeks came pouring out of her. Boone stood back by the door, his hat in his hand, his expression unreadable, but his presence a solid, comforting anchor. "They've been very quiet," Miss Whitcomb said, her voice a little softer now. "They don't speak much." "They will," Gentry said, her voice muffled in Katie's soft curls. "They just need to be somewhere that remembers the sound of their names." Miss Whitcomb glanced from Gentry to Boone. "And he is—" Gentry stood up, the children still clinging to her hands, refusing to let go. She looked at Boone, and for the first time she knew exactly what he was. "He's the man who helped me find my way home." The matron looked at the weary judge, at the steady, quiet man by the door, and at the woman with 2 children clutching her like she was the only solid thing in the world. She gave a single, slow nod. "Then I believe they will be just fine." That night they stayed in a small room at the town inn. One large bed for Gentry and the children, and a cot for Boone in the corner. Kellen and Katie wouldn't let her go, each of them holding one of her hands as they fell into an exhausted sleep. Gentry lay awake for hours, listening to their soft breathing. She looked over at Boone. In the faint moonlight slanting through the window, she could see he was awake too. He was watching her. Their eyes met across the quiet room. No words were spoken. None were needed. They had won. The battle was over. But Gentry knew, deep in her bones, that the war for these children's hearts was just beginning. Returning to Boone's homestead was like stepping into a different world. It was the same small house, the same quiet land, but now it was filled with the hesitant presence of 2 small, wounded souls. The children were like wild birds, watchful and easily startled. Katie stayed glued to Gentry's side, her small hand often gripping the hem of Gentry's skirt. She wouldn't speak above a whisper. Kellen was even more withdrawn. He was a ghost in the house, silent and observant, his eyes holding a depth of sorrow that no child should ever know. He followed Boone around the ranch at a distance, a small shadow trailing a quiet man, never getting too close. Boone was patient. He never crowded them, never pushed them to talk. He'd show Kellen how to carry a small pail of feed, or how to whittle a piece of wood into a rough shape, speaking in a low, calm voice. He'd leave small gifts for Katie on the porch rail, a pretty blue feather, a smooth, round stone from the creek, simple offerings that asked for nothing in return. One afternoon, as Gentry sat on the porch mending one of Kellen's torn shirts, Katie climbed into her lap without a word and laid her head against her chest. Gentry stopped sewing and just wrapped her arms around the little girl, holding her tight. The quiet weight of the child in her arms was both a comfort and a terrible burden. Later that week, Boone was fixing a broken hinge on the barn door. Kellen was crouched nearby, watching a line of ants march across the dirt. "He saw something, didn't he?" Boone said, his voice low, not looking up from his work. Gentry, who was gathering eggs nearby, stopped. "What do you mean?" "The day his mother died," Boone said, his hands stilling. "He was there. I see it in his eyes. He's carrying a secret that's too heavy for him." The thought made Gentry's blood run cold. She had been so focused on Everett's cruelty, she hadn't considered what the children might have witnessed. That evening, after Katie was asleep, Gentry found Kellen sitting by the cold hearth, staring into the empty fireplace. She sat down on the floor beside him. "Your mother loved you very much," she said softly. Kellen didn't look at her. He just kept staring at the ashes. "She used to tell me stories about you," Gentry went on. "She said you were the bravest boy she knew." A single fat tear rolled down Kellen's cheek and dropped onto his dusty trousers. "It wasn't the ladder," he whispered, his voice so quiet she could barely hear him. Gentry's heart stopped. "What, honey? What wasn't the ladder?" He finally turned to look at her, his eyes wide and haunted. "Mama didn't fall. He pushed her." The confession, spoken into the quiet of the room, was like a physical blow. Gentry pulled the boy into her arms as he began to sob. Great, wrenching sounds that seemed to be torn from the very depths of his soul. He cried for his mother. He cried for the terrible secret he had been forced to keep. Boone had come to stand in the doorway, drawn by the sound. He listened as Kellen, between sobs, told them everything. He'd been hiding in the hayloft. He'd heard his parents arguing. He'd heard his mother say she was leaving, that she was taking the children with her, and he'd seen Everett, in a fit of rage, shove her with all his might. He'd watched her fall. Everett had seen him then, a small face peering down from the loft. He had pointed a finger at him and told him that if he ever told anyone what he saw, he would be next. Gentry held the trembling boy and rocked him, murmuring words of comfort, her own tears mixing with his. Boone knelt down beside them and placed a large, steady hand on Kellen's back. "You don't have to be scared anymore, son," Boone said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe now. I promise. No one will ever hurt you again." That night was a turning point. Kellen's terrible confession, once spoken aloud, seemed to lose some of its power over him. The secret was out, shared between the three of them, a grim foundation upon which they could start to build. It removed any lingering shred of doubt or guilt about what had happened to Everett. He hadn't just been a thief and a bully, he had been a murderer, and he had gotten exactly what he deserved. In the days that followed, a subtle shift occurred. The house began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Katie started to hum little tunes while she played. Kellen began to speak in full sentences, even asking Boone if he could help him saddle the mare. One evening, after the children were tucked into their beds in the room that had once been Gentry's, Boone stepped out onto the porch. Gentry followed him, pulling her shawl tight against the evening chill. The moon was high and bright, washing the land in a silvery light. "I've been thinking," Boone said, his voice low, "about building another room off the back. A proper room for the children, with a window that faces the sunrise." Gentry smiled. "I think they would like that." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "And I've been thinking about something else. This room, the one you were staying in, it's been empty too long. It shouldn't be a guest room anymore." He took a step closer, his hands finding hers. They were warm and calloused and strong. "Gentry," he said, her name a soft prayer on his lips. "I know this isn't how things are supposed to be done. There's been no courtship, no proper time. But nothing about us has been proper. And I can't imagine this house without you in it. I can't imagine my life without you in it." He took a shaky breath. "Will you marry me? Will you help me build a life here, with these children? Will you make this place a real home?" Tears welled in Gentry's eyes, but for the first time in a long, long time, they were tears of pure joy. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." He kissed her then, under the vast, star-dusted sky. It wasn't a kiss of desperate passion or sudden relief. It was a kiss of certainty, a kiss that promised forevers, a kiss that felt like, after a long and brutal journey, she was finally, truly home. They were married by the circuit judge a month later, not in a church, but on the front porch of the small house that had become their world. Gentry wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself. Boone wore his clean Sunday shirt. Kellen stood beside Boone as his witness, and Katie, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers, stood beside Gentry. Elias Tompkins, the old rancher from down the creek, came and brought them a freshly baked apple pie as a wedding gift. It was a small, quiet affair, but it was filled with a profound sense of rightness. Life settled into the rhythms of the seasons. Boone and Kellen started building the new room for the children, the sound of their hammers echoing in the clear autumn air. Gentry and Katie planted a small garden near the porch, their hands in the rich, dark earth. The first snow fell, blanketing the land in a soft, white silence. The world outside grew cold and harsh, but inside the little house, a steady warmth grew. It was the warmth of a fire in the hearth, of soup simmering on the stove, of 4 people who had been broken and lost, finding a way to piece themselves back together, to create something whole and new. One morning, Boone came in from the barn, his shoulders dusted with snow. He was carrying a long, smooth piece of birchwood. He set it on the workbench he'd built in the corner of the main room. He looked at Gentry, a slow, shy smile spreading across his face. "Think we could build a cradle?" he asked. Gentry's hand went to her stomach, where a new secret, a new life, was just beginning to stir. She hadn't told him yet. She had been waiting for the right moment. She looked at him, her eyes wide with wonder. "How did you know?" He stepped closer, his hands gently sliding around her waist, pulling her close. "I didn't," he said, his voice soft as the falling snow. "But for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to hope." When the baby came, it was in the deep heat of the following summer. A girl, with a shock of dark hair like her mother's and quiet, watchful eyes like her father's. They named her Eliza Clara Prescott. Eliza for Boone's mother, and Clara for the sister whose memory was stitched into the very fabric of their family. Kellen, no longer a silent, haunted boy, but a strong, confident young man, carved her a beautiful rattle from the same birchwood Boone had used for her cradle. Katie, who now chattered and sang from sunup to sundown, sang the baby to sleep every night. Years passed. The apple saplings they planted along the west fence grew tall and strong, bearing sweet, crisp fruit each fall. The new room became a place of laughter and stories. The ranch thrived. The children grew up, running barefoot through the grass in the summer and reading books by the firelight in the winter. Gentry taught Eliza to sew on the old treadle machine, the same machine that held so many secrets, teaching her how to stitch scraps into something beautiful and lasting. Boone taught Kellen how to build a fence that was straight and strong, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to be a good and decent man. They grew old together, not all at once, but slowly, in the small, quiet ways that matter. In the silver that crept into Gentry's hair, in the softening of the lines around Boone's eyes, in the hands that knew each other so well they could find each other in the dark without even trying. And every night, they lay together under the quilt Gentry had made when she first arrived, a quilt patched together from her own old dresses, Boone's worn-out shirts, and the faded flour sacks that had fed them when they had nothing else. It was a map of their lives, a story of survival and sorrow, of justice and love. Their fingers would twine together in the quiet space between sleep and waking, a silent promise renewed each night. In a small house tucked away in the hills, a family that was never supposed to exist had found its home, and nothing, ever after, was lonely again. If you were moved by Gentry and Boone's story of finding hope in the darkest of times, please hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more stories that remind us that even after the harshest winter, spring will always come.